The helicopter never actually landed. It hovered just a few feet above the jungle canopy as 6 men jumped into a tiny clearing carved out of the dense forests of Laos. Within seconds, the aircraft disappeared back into the sky, leaving behind only the fading sound of rotor blades and an eerie silence. Officially, these men did not exist. If they were captured, wounded, or killed, the United States government could deny they had ever crossed the border. Yet for the men of MACV SOG, this was just another mission. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had become far more than a conventional conflict. While American forces fought openly in South Vietnam, another war unfolded in the shadows. North Vietnamese troops continuously moved soldiers, weapons, and supplies through an intricate web of jungle trails stretching across Laos and Cambodia. Known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this logistical network became the lifeline of Hanoi's war effort. Destroying it became one of America's highest priorities, but doing so required crossing international borders that Washington officially claimed it was not entering. To solve this impossible problem, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, better known as MACV SOG, was created in 1964. Despite its misleading name, it was far more than a research organization. It was one of the most secretive special operations units ever assembled by the United States. Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Air Force personnel, Marines, CIA advisors, and highly trained indigenous commandos worked together on missions so sensitive that many remained classified for decades. Their orders were simple to explain, but almost impossible to carry out. Slip across the border without being detected. Observe enemy movements, plant listening devices, capture prisoners if possible, rescue downed pilots, conduct sabotage missions deep inside territory controlled by the North Vietnamese army, and above all else, leave no evidence that American troops had ever been there. Every operation began long before the helicopter left the ground. Reconnaissance teams were usually made up of only 3 American Green Berets, accompanied by several highly experienced indigenous fighters, many of whom came from the Montagnard tribes of Vietnam's Central Highlands, or the Nung people. Each man carried far more than his own weight in equipment. Radios, ammunition, explosives, maps, medical supplies, emergency rations, and survival gear filled their packs. Every item had been carefully selected because once the helicopter disappeared, there would be no resupply. Unlike conventional infantry units, these teams avoided combat whenever possible. Their greatest weapon was invisibility. They moved silently beneath the thick jungle canopy, carefully avoiding trails, villages, and river crossings that might reveal their presence. Every broken branch, every muddy footprint, every discarded ration wrapper could expose the team to thousands of enemy soldiers operating nearby. The jungle itself became an enemy. Towering trees blocked sunlight, leaving the ground permanently damp. Monsoon rains soaked clothing for days at a time. Leeches clung to exposed skin, while insects spread disease and exhaustion. Visibility often dropped to only a few meters. The thick vegetation swallowed sound, making it nearly impossible to know whether footsteps belonged to teammates or an approaching patrol. Then there were the trackers. The North Vietnamese army developed highly skilled tracking units specifically trained to hunt reconnaissance teams. They could read tiny disturbances in leaves, broken vines, or displaced soil that ordinary soldiers would never notice. Some even studied the unique habits of American patrols, learning how they moved through the jungle and predicting where they would travel next. For MACV SOG operators, this meant every halt became a calculated risk. They rarely stayed in one place for long. Camps were hidden with extraordinary care, and fires were almost never lit. Meals were cold. Conversations were whispered. Even sleep came in short shifts, with someone always watching the darkness beyond the trees. Yet despite every precaution, many missions unraveled with terrifying speed. Sometimes the first sign of discovery was complete silence. Birds stopped singing, insects disappeared. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Experienced operators learned to fear those moments more than gunfire. Nature often detected approaching soldiers before humans could. Other times, it happened in an instant. A single burst of automatic fire would erupt from concealed positions, followed by explosions from rocket-propelled grenades tearing through the trees. Recon teams that expected to observe the enemy suddenly found themselves facing companies or even battalions of North Vietnamese soldiers. The odds were staggering. A 6- or 8-man team could find itself pursued by hundreds of enemy troops, determined to prevent any intelligence from leaving the jungle. Retreat became the only option. Radio operators immediately called for emergency extraction, while every available aircraft scrambled toward their location. But rescue was rarely immediate. Helicopters had to fly through hostile territory, protected by anti-aircraft guns and hidden machine gun positions. Pilots often risked their own lives hovering above tiny jungle clearings, while enemy bullets ripped through the surrounding trees. To survive until help arrived, reconnaissance teams relied on carefully rehearsed drills. Claymore mines were positioned to delay pursuit. Smoke grenades marked extraction zones. Airstrikes and helicopter gunships hammered enemy positions, sometimes only meters away from friendly troops. It was controlled chaos where every decision carried life or death consequences. For the men of MACV SOG, the mission had never truly been about winning battles. Their greatest victory was escaping the jungle alive, and for many teams, the most dangerous part of the operation was still waiting. By the time a reconnaissance team reported that it had been compromised, the situation was often already spiraling out of control. Every second mattered. The radio operator would transmit a coded emergency signal, sometimes speaking only a few carefully chosen words before switching frequencies or moving to avoid enemy direction-finding equipment. The message was enough. Somewhere dozens of miles away, helicopters, fighter aircraft, and command centers instantly shifted into action. But getting help into the jungle was never simple. Most MACV SOG missions took place in some of the most heavily defended areas of Southeast Asia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was no ordinary supply route. It was an enormous network of roads, footpaths, rivers, fuel pipelines, truck parks, hospitals, and hidden storage depots stretching through the mountains of Laos and Cambodia. Every year, North Vietnam expanded and improved it. Thousands of soldiers protected the trail, and anti-aircraft guns guarded key routes against American aircraft. For reconnaissance teams hidden beneath the jungle canopy, this meant they were operating inside territory where the enemy often outnumbered them by hundreds to one. Their primary objective was intelligence. Every observation mattered. A column of trucks moving south under darkness. Fresh tire tracks leading toward a hidden depot. Newly constructed bridges across mountain streams. Anti-aircraft positions concealed beneath camouflage nets. Even counting boot prints on muddy trails could reveal the movement of entire divisions preparing for future offensives. The information these teams collected guided bombing campaigns, rescue operations, and military planning across the theater. Yet obtaining it required extraordinary patience. Teams sometimes remained motionless for hours, lying beneath leaves and branches while enemy patrols walked only a few meters away. Mosquitoes bit exposed skin. Ants crawled across uniforms, muscles cramped from remaining perfectly still. No one dared move. Veterans later described these moments as some of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. Combat was frightening, but at least it offered the chance to fight back. Remaining absolutely silent while armed soldiers unknowingly passed within arm's reach demanded a different kind of courage. The danger increased with every passing day. Although missions were carefully planned, the North Vietnamese army gradually learned that small reconnaissance teams were operating deep behind their lines. Rather than treating them as isolated commandos, they began committing large forces to hunt them. Specialized tracking units searched relentlessly, while nearby infantry battalions established blocking positions to cut off escape routes. Suddenly, reconnaissance missions transformed into desperate survival exercises. Many operators recalled hearing whistles echo through the jungle after first contact. These were signals between North Vietnamese units, directing converging forces toward the team's position. Within minutes, scattered rifle fire often developed into coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Teams found themselves maneuvering through unfamiliar terrain while avoiding encirclement by a vastly larger force. In those moments, every member of the patrol had a specific responsibility. The team leader navigated toward the planned extraction area while constantly adapting to changing conditions. The assistant team leader coordinated security and watched for ambushes. Radio operators maintained communication with aircraft overhead despite enemy attempts to locate their transmissions. Indigenous scouts frequently took point, using their remarkable knowledge of jungle movement to identify safer routes through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. Trust between these men became absolute. Language barriers, cultural differences, and backgrounds disappeared under the constant pressure of survival. Every decision depended on confidence that the person beside you would react instantly under fire. Many veterans later spoke of these partnerships as stronger than almost any relationship they experienced before or after the war. When contact became unavoidable, fire discipline was critical. Recon teams rarely attempted prolonged firefights. Instead, they delivered short, accurate bursts while moving continuously through dense vegetation. Claymore mines and fragmentation grenades delayed pursuing forces just long enough to create precious distance. Smoke concealed movement, while aircraft overhead searched desperately for any opening to reach the trapped patrol. Above the jungle, another battle unfolded. Helicopter crews flying rescue missions knowingly entered some of the most dangerous airspace in Vietnam. Pilots often descended through heavy machine gun fire into landing zones barely large enough for their aircraft. Sometimes there was no landing zone at all. Helicopters hovered just above the trees, while exhausted operators sprinted through gunfire, grabbing landing skids or cargo doors as the aircraft climbed away. Even successful extractions rarely ended without casualties. Aircraft frequently returned riddled with bullet holes. Crew chiefs fired thousands of rounds from door-mounted machine guns to suppress enemy positions. Escort gunships attacked surrounding hillsides while fighter aircraft dropped bombs dangerously close to friendly forces. Every rescue demanded extraordinary coordination between soldiers on the ground and air crews risking everything to bring them home. Yet despite overwhelming danger, the missions continued. Again and again, small MACV SOG teams disappeared into hostile territory because commanders believed the intelligence they gathered justified the enormous risks. For the men carrying out those orders, however, the war was measured less in strategic objectives than in surviving one patrol long enough to begin the next. And as the conflict intensified, so did the scale of the operations, pushing these elite teams into even more dangerous missions, where survival depended not only on skill, but on extraordinary determination and a measure of luck. By 1968, MACV SOG had become one of the most experienced special operations organizations in the Vietnam War. But experience came at a terrible price. Every successful mission taught valuable lessons, yet it also revealed just how quickly the enemy was adapting. North Vietnamese commanders no longer viewed the reconnaissance teams as isolated spies. They recognized them as a serious threat to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they devoted increasing numbers of troops to hunting them down before they could escape. The jungle itself became a battlefield without front lines. Every ridge, stream, and patch of bamboo could hide an ambush. North Vietnamese soldiers planted false trails designed to lure patrols into kill zones. They hung equipment from trees to confuse aerial observers and built convincing fake supply depots to waste American bombing missions. It was a constant contest of deception, where both sides relied on patience as much as firepower. To counter these tactics, MACV SOG teams became masters of improvisation. Routes were changed at the last moment. Landing zones were abandoned if even the slightest sign of enemy activity appeared. Teams deliberately crossed rivers multiple times to confuse trackers and climbed rocky terrain where footprints disappeared. Sometimes they spent hours circling back simply to determine whether they were being followed. Still, there were moments when no amount of preparation could prevent disaster. One of the most dangerous situations occurred when a reconnaissance team became surrounded before reaching its extraction point. Helicopters could not simply land wherever they wished. Dense jungle often left only a few tiny openings in the canopy, many already covered by enemy machine guns. Pilots had to make split-second decisions while under intense fire, often hovering just long enough for exhausted operators to leap aboard. These rescues became legendary among the men who flew them. Army helicopter crews and Air Force pilots repeatedly entered areas where the chances of being shot down were extraordinarily high. Gunship escorts swept the tree lines with rockets and machine gun fire, while fighter aircraft delivered airstrikes alarmingly close to friendly positions. Thick smoke, exploding artillery, and towering jungle trees reduced visibility to almost nothing. Yet the pilots kept coming because they understood a simple truth. If they turned back, the men below would almost certainly be left behind. For those trapped on the ground, every passing minute felt endless. A radio transmission announcing that rescue aircraft were only 5 minutes away often felt like an eternity, while enemy soldiers closed in from every direction. Ammunition dwindled, water ran low, wounded teammates had to be carried across steep hillsides slick with mud. Every delay increased the risk that the extraction zone would be completely overrun before help arrived. Some missions ended in dramatic escapes that seemed almost impossible. Helicopters lifted away with soldiers clinging to landing skids or hanging from ropes because there was no time to fully board the aircraft. Other missions ended in tragedy, with teams suffering heavy casualties or members disappearing into enemy hands, their fate remaining unknown for years. Yet despite the losses, volunteers continued stepping forward. Many MACV SOG operators completed multiple cross-border missions, fully aware that each insertion could be their last. They understood the risks better than anyone. Every briefing included the possibility that capture would bring interrogation, imprisonment, or death. Because the operations were officially denied, they also knew their government might not publicly acknowledge where they had been or what they had done. That burden extended far beyond the battlefield. When many veterans returned home, they found themselves unable to discuss the missions that had defined their lives. Security classifications prevented them from speaking openly, even with family members. Stories of extraordinary courage remained locked away in classified files, while the public knew little about the secret war taking place beyond Vietnam's recognized borders. Only decades later, as records were gradually declassified and veterans began sharing their experiences, did the scale of MACV SOG's operations become widely understood. Historians discovered accounts of remarkably small teams gathering intelligence that influenced major military decisions, rescuing isolated personnel under impossible conditions, and surviving encounters that would have overwhelmed much larger conventional units. The legacy of MACV SOG extends far beyond Vietnam. Many of the reconnaissance techniques, survival methods, and joint special operations practices developed during these missions influenced later generations of American Special Operations Forces. Their experiences shaped doctrine, training, and equipment that continue to affect elite military units today. But perhaps the greatest lesson of MACV SOG was not about tactics or technology. It was about the extraordinary demands placed upon a handful of individuals who were asked to fight a war that officially did not exist. They entered countries their government denied entering. They carried out missions that remained hidden for years. They operated in some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, often outnumbered by hundreds to one, relying on skill, teamwork, and determination simply to survive another day. For many of these men, victory was never measured by territory captured or battles won. It was measured by bringing every teammate home, protecting the intelligence they had gathered, and climbing aboard the extraction helicopter before the jungle closed in behind them. The true horrors of MACV SOG were not defined only by firefights, hidden traps, or overwhelming enemy numbers. They were found in the relentless uncertainty, the knowledge that every mission might end in silence, every rescue might arrive too late, and every sacrifice might remain unknown to the world for decades. Today, the dense jungles of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam have largely reclaimed the battlefields where these secret operations unfolded. The trails have faded, the explosions have long since stopped, and nature has covered many of the scars left by war. Yet beneath those forests lies the story of one of the most secretive and dangerous chapters of the Vietnam War. A story of courage, sacrifice, and survival carried out by men whose greatest achievements remained hidden in the shadows for far too long.